The first thing I noticed was how quiet the office had become. Not the kind of quiet that settles in on a Friday afternoon when people start drifting toward the weekend. This was different. It was the kind of quiet that follows a decision someone has already made. A decision you weren't part of, even though it was entirely about you. I set my coffee mug down on the desk I had used for 17 years and looked out the window at the Toronto skyline. Gray November sky, the kind that sits low over the city like a lid. I had seen that sky from that window through 3 mayors, 2 recessions, and more budget cycles than I could count. I knew every crack in the parking lot below. I knew which elevator ran slow on cold mornings. I knew where the backup generator relay was located, which breakers to pull in sequence during a campus-wide shutdown, and why the East Wing server room needed an extra 15 minutes of cooldown before a hard restart. I knew things about that hospital that no org chart had ever captured. But that morning, none of it seemed to matter. My name is Douglas Mercer. I'm 63 years old, and I spent the better part of my working life keeping the health record system running at Lakeview Regional Medical Center, just outside Toronto. 17 years. I started there when my youngest was still in middle school, and the hospital was still using a hybrid paper and digital intake process that made your eyes water just to look at it. By the time I was done, we had migrated through 3 full system generations, survived 2 provincial audits, onboarded 4 satellite clinics, and kept everything running through a pandemic that pushed every process we had to its absolute limit. I was not a flashy man. I never asked for recognition. I showed up early, and I stayed late, and I did the work, because the work mattered. When a nurse couldn't pull up a patient's allergy history at 2 in the morning, it was my phone that rang. When the pharmacy module threw an error on Christmas Eve, I was the one who drove in through the snow to fix it. When Accreditation Canada came through for their triennial review, I was the one who made sure every audit trail was clean, every log was accessible, and every compliance flag was resolved before they walked through the door. That was my job. That was my life. And then, one Tuesday morning in late October, my director called me into his office and told me I was being replaced. His name was Gerald Foss. He had been my direct supervisor for about 3 years, brought in from outside the health sector with a mandate to modernize and streamline operations. Gerald was the kind of man who used the word leverage as a verb and believed that any problem could be solved if you found the right vendor. He wore nice shoes and spoke in the kind of language that sounded like it meant something until you tried to write it down. He told me that the hospital had signed a contract with a company called Opticore Health Solutions, based out of Calgary, and that Opticore would be taking over IT infrastructure management effective the 1st of January. He said this was a cost-efficiency decision made at the board level. He said my institutional knowledge would be captured through a structured knowledge transfer process. He said the word transition 11 times. I counted. I asked him when this had been decided. He said the board had approved it in September. 2 months earlier. While I had been spending my evenings preparing the documentation package for our upcoming Accreditation Canada review, scheduled for February, the board had already decided I wouldn't be there for it. I asked if there was a severance arrangement. He slid a folder across the desk. Standard package. 17 weeks. A form to sign. I didn't sign anything that day. I thanked him for telling me, picked up my coffee, and walked back to my desk. That night, I sat at my kitchen table in Mississauga and told my wife, Paulette, what had happened. She put her hand over mine and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, Doug, what are they going to do without you? I told her I honestly didn't know. The thing about a health record system in a hospital of that size is that it is not like a spreadsheet. It is not something you hand off with a 2-page summary and a good handshake. Lakeview had 847 beds. 6 departments with separate legacy configurations, a pharmacy integration that had been custom-built during the 2019 migration, and a provincial data-sharing interface with eHealth Ontario that had its own compliance schedule and its own quirks that I had spent 2 years learning. Every element of that system had a history, every configuration decision had a reason, and most of those reasons lived in my head. Gerald had assured me that Opticore had extensive experience with healthcare IT environments across Western Canada. What he did not seem to understand, or chose not to understand, was that healthcare IT in Alberta and healthcare IT in Ontario operate under different regulatory frameworks, different provincial data standards, and different accreditation requirements. The fact that a company had done this work in Calgary did not mean they were prepared to do it in Mississauga 3 weeks before an accreditation review. But I was not asked for my opinion on that. What I was asked to do, over the following 6 weeks, was participate in a knowledge transfer. This meant sitting in a series of meetings with two young men from Opticor. I will call them the lead consultant and his associate, because I have no interest in naming them specifically and answering their questions while they typed notes into a shared document. They were not unintelligent. They asked reasonable questions, but the questions they asked told me very clearly what they did not yet know they needed to ask. They did not ask about the pharmacy integration timeout sequence. They did not ask about the manual override protocol for the East Wing patient portal during scheduled maintenance windows. They did not ask why we had a standing exception flag in the eHealth Ontario feed for patients transferred from Halton Hills, or what the workaround was, or why it existed. They did not ask these things because they did not know these things existed, and I answered what I was asked, fully and honestly, and I did not volunteer what I was not asked. That was not obstruction. That was simply the natural limit of a 6-week knowledge transfer for 17 years of institutional memory. My last official day was December 31st. I packed my desk on the afternoon of the 30th because I wanted to do it quietly, without a crowd. A few colleagues stopped by. My friend Annette, from Health Records, brought a small cake. The overnight security guard, a man named Bertrand who had worked that building for as long as I had, shook my hand in the parking garage and said, "Place won't be the same, Mr. Mercer." I believed him. I drove home on the last evening of the year. Paulette had made a roast. We watched the fireworks from the living room window. I went to bed at 10:30. January was quiet. I will be honest with you. Those first weeks were not easy. I am not a man who handles stillness well. For 17 years I had been needed in a very specific and concrete way, and that need had structured my days, my evenings, my thinking. Without it, I felt unmoored. I took long walks by the lake. I helped Paulette reorganize the garage. I read 3 books I had been meaning to read for years. But underneath all of it was a low hum of something I could not quite name, awaiting, maybe. A sense that the story was not finished. The Accreditation Canada review was scheduled for the 2nd week of February. I knew the exact date because I had put it in my own calendar 17 months earlier and had been tracking the preparation milestones ever since. Old habits. I said nothing to anyone. I simply noted the date and went about my retirement. On a Wednesday morning in the 1st week of February, my cell phone rang. The number was a hospital extension I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I didn't. The voice on the other end was Gerald Foss. He did not open with a greeting. He said, "Doug, we have a situation." I said, "Good morning, Gerald." There was a pause. Then he said they were experiencing significant issues with the eHealth Ontario data feed. The provincial interface had thrown a validation error that was causing patient transfer records to fail on import. The Accreditation Canada reviewers were arriving in 5 days. The compliance documentation that required a clean, verified data feed documentation I had spent months preparing before my departure was now flagging errors that Opticor could not resolve. I asked him what kind of validation error. He read me a code. I recognized it immediately. It was the Halton Hills exception flag. The exact issue I had managed, manually, for 3 years, via a standing workaround that existed nowhere in the official documentation because it had been built as a temporary patch during a provincial system update in 2021 and had simply never been formalized. The workaround was in my head, and in one other place, as it turned out, but I didn't mention that second place yet. I told Gerald I understood the issue and that I would need some time to consider my availability. He said the situation was urgent. I said I understood that. He asked if I could come in the next morning. I said I would call him back by end of day. Then I went to my home office and opened my laptop. When I had left Lakeview, I had done everything by the book. I had returned my access badge, surrendered my system credentials, and cleared my work laptop before handing it in. I had taken nothing proprietary. I had not copied patient data or confidential records of any kind. That was not what I was looking at. What I was looking at were my own personal working notes, which I had kept in a private folder on my personal laptop throughout my tenure, not patient records, not system data, but my own documentation. Notes on configuration decisions, notes on workarounds and the reasoning behind them. Notes I had written for myself, because I was the kind of man who wrote things down. And alongside those notes was something I had almost forgotten about. When Lakeview had implemented its current EMR platform back in 2018, the vendor had set up an automated system logging environment that captured every configuration change, every manual intervention, every exception flag, and every workaround applied to the live system. This was standard practice for compliance purposes. These logs were stored on the hospital's own servers, and they were, technically, accessible to any credentialed administrator. OptiCore had inherited those credentials. What they had apparently not been told because Gerald had not thought to ask me, and the lead consultant had not known to look, was that the log archive for the period between 2018 and 2024 was stored in a legacy folder structure that the new OptiCore team had not mapped during their OptiCore onboarding. It was sitting there, untouched and complete, containing 6 years of system history, including every instance of the Halton Hills workaround being applied, the exact steps taken each time, and the precise parameter values that made it work. I knew where to look, because I had built the folder structure myself. I also knew something else. Those logs, taken together, told a very clear story about the complexity of what I had managed. They documented hundreds of interventions, patches, and custom configurations over 6 years. They showed, in timestamp detail, exactly what institutional knowledge looked like when it was put into practice. Day after day, for 17 years. They were not a smoking gun. They were something quieter and more powerful than that. They were proof of what I was worth. I called my son-in-law that evening. His name is Kevin, and he works as a labor lawyer in downtown Toronto. I told him what had happened and asked him a few questions. He listened carefully and then said, "Dad, don't sign that severance form yet." I told him I hadn't. He said, "Good. Call me tomorrow before you call the hospital back." I called Kevin the next morning. We talked for 45 minutes. By the end of the conversation, I had a very clear picture of where I stood, and it was considerably stronger ground than I had been standing on the morning Gerald Foss slid that folder across his desk. I called Gerald back that afternoon. I told him I was willing to assist with the eHealth Ontario issue and the accreditation preparation. I told him I was available on a consulting basis, effective immediately. I named my rate. It was not a modest rate. It reflected the specific, urgent, time-sensitive nature of the engagement, and it reflected the fact that I was the only person in a position to resolve the issue within the required time frame. There was a long silence on Gerald's end. Then he said, "Doug, we were hoping this could be handled informally, given your history with the organization." I said, "Gerald, I appreciate that, but I'm no longer an employee. I'm a consultant, and consultants have rates." Another silence. He said he would need to speak with the CFO. I said I would hold my availability until 5 o'clock. He called back at 4:40. They accepted my rate. I went in the next morning. I located the legacy log archive in under 20 minutes and extracted the Halton Hills workaround documentation. I walked the OptiCore lead consultant through the parameter configuration step by step. He was a fast learner. To his credit, he understood it on the first pass and implemented it correctly. The eHealth Ontario feed was clean by noon. That afternoon, I spent 3 hours with the compliance team reviewing the accreditation documentation package I had originally prepared. Most of it was still accurate. A few sections needed updating to reflect the OptiCore transition. I flagged those sections, provided the corrected information, and left detailed written notes for follow-up. I was out of the building by 4 o'clock. The Accreditation Canada review took place the following week. I was not there for it. I didn't need to be. I heard through Annette, who still worked in health records, that it had gone smoothly. No major findings. The eHealth Ontario feed was clean. The compliance documentation was in order. Gerald sent me an email a week later asking if I would be available for an ongoing consulting arrangement to support the OptiCore transition through the spring. He framed it as an exciting opportunity. I thought about it for 2 days. Then I wrote back and said I was unavailable. I thanked him for the kind words and wished the team well. I meant it. I genuinely wished them well. But I had done what I came to do, I had been compensated fairly for it, and I had nothing left to prove to that organization. My time now belonged to me, to Paulette, to the grandchildren, to the long walks by the lake that I had started to love more than I ever expected. Kevin told me later that the severance package I had originally been offered was likely undervalued given my years of service and the circumstances of the transition. He helped me renegotiate it. The final figure was considerably more than the original 17 weeks. Gerald was not pleased. The HR director was not pleased. But they signed. I signed too. And I walked out of that building for the last time on a cold March afternoon with a folder of paperwork under my arm and 17 years of work properly accounted for. I have thought a great deal, since then, about what that whole experience taught me. Not about hospitals or software systems or provincial compliance frameworks, but about the nature of work itself and what it means to know your own value. For most of my career, I operated from a kind of quiet faith. I believed that if I did good work, consistently, over a long period of time, the work would speak for itself. I believed that competence was its own protection. I believed that an organization that depended on you would recognize that dependence and treat you accordingly. I was not entirely wrong, but I was not entirely right either. What I have come to understand is that competence is necessary, but it is not sufficient. You must also know what your competence is worth, be able to articulate it clearly, and be willing to stand on that ground even when the ground feels uncomfortable. The moment Gerald slid that severance folder across the desk, he was making an assumption about how I would respond. He assumed I would be grateful, or at least compliant. He assumed the urgency of the situation, when it arrived, would work in his favor, that I would come running because I was the kind of man who always came running. He was not wrong about my instincts. My first instinct, when that phone rang in February, was to say yes, to drive in, to fix the problem because the problem needed fixing, and I knew how to fix it, and people were counting on it being fixed. That instinct came from the same place as 17 years of 2 a.m. phone calls and Christmas Eve drives through the snow. It came from caring about the work. But caring about the work does not mean you are required to give your work away. My son-in-law Kevin said something to me during that 45-minute phone call that I have turned over in my mind many times since. He said, "Dad, the hospital made a business decision. You are entitled to make one too." That was clarifying. Not because it was cynical. Kevin is not a cynical man, but because it was precise. It cut through the fog of obligation and loyalty and bruised feelings that had been clouding my thinking since October, and it left something very simple in its place. I was a professional with a specific and demonstrable expertise, and professionals charge for their expertise. That is not greed. That is not bitterness. That is the basic arithmetic of a fair transaction. And there is something else I want to say, because I think it matters. I did not win because I was clever. I did not win because I outmaneuvered anyone or planned some elaborate response. I won, if winning is even the right word, because I had spent 17 years doing the work properly. The logs existed because I had insisted on proper documentation. The workaround was recoverable because I had written it down. The accreditation package was largely complete because I had started preparing it months in advance, the way I always did everything. None of that was strategy. It was just the residue of doing the job right, year after year, and trusting that it mattered. It mattered. If you are reading this and you are somewhere in the middle of a long career, doing work that feels invisible, doing work that no one seems to notice until something goes wrong, I want you to hear this clearly. Keep your records. Write things down. Document your decisions and the reasons behind them, not because you are planning to fight anyone, but because the record of your work is the most honest account of your value that will ever exist. And there may come a day when that account needs to speak for you. And if someone makes a business decision that treats your expertise as replaceable, take a breath. Consult someone you trust. Don't sign anything right away. Because what feels like the end of something is sometimes simply a renegotiation of terms. And the strongest position in any negotiation is knowing exactly what you bring to the table. I know what I brought. The logs proved it. The timestamps proved it. The Clean eHealth Ontario feed on the morning of the accreditation review proved it, and the figure on the revised severance agreement proved it in language that everyone understood. Paulette and I are going to Nova Scotia in the spring. We have been talking about it for years, and we keep finding reasons to delay, the way you do when life is busy and the calendar is always full. The calendar is not as full now. We booked the trip last week, 2 weeks in Cape Breton, staying in a little place near the Cabot Trail that her sister recommended. I am looking forward to it more than I can say. The lake is frozen over now. I walked along the shore this morning, early, before Paulette was up. The ice goes out almost to the horizon, gray and white, and still. A handful of geese were standing near the edge, utterly unbothered by the cold. I stood there for a while and thought about Gerald Foss, and the quiet office, and the folder he slid across the desk. I thought about the 45-minute phone call with Kevin, and the conversation where everything became clear. I thought about the morning I walked back into that building and found the log archive in 20 minutes and fixed a 3-year-old problem in half a day. Then I thought about Nova Scotia, about Paulette, about the grandchildren coming to visit in the summer. The geese eventually decided it was time to go somewhere else. They lifted off without any particular urgency, found their formation, and disappeared over the tree line. I walked home and made breakfast. That felt like enough.